Welcome to Issues class. This is part one on the First Amendment religion clauses. So we have packets out there. If you're watching online now, later, and you want the big detailed package, just send me an email and I will email it to you. So a couple of the big questions we're going to look at over the next 2 Sundays. First is, why did the founding generation write protections for religious liberty into the First Amendment? What is the Establishment Clause? What was the founders' vision for this provision of the First Amendment? And how has the Supreme Court interpreted it over time? That's one of the key things, right? You can have something written, but it's how it's interpreted over time. We just talked about that in Timely Topics with the freedom of speech, that it wasn't until after 1925 that the Supreme Court also interpreted that to have protection against the state government, not just the federal government. So things change over time. So how it's interpreted is really important. What is the Free Exercise Clause? What was the founders' vision for this provision? And how has the Supreme Court interpreted it? And what are some of the most important areas of constitutional debate over religious liberty today? So First Amendment text, a brief introduction. So let's begin, as we should always do when interpreting the Constitution or any other document, start with the text itself. It says, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. So there's our 2 clauses. The First Amendment protects religious liberty in 2 ways. First, it guards against government establishing a religion. And second, it protects the free exercise of religion. Together, these constitutional promises are at the core of our freedom of conscience, the right to freely believe as we wish. And how we express that belief is also tied up in the freedom of speech clause in that First Amendment. So there are 2 religion clauses. The first is the Establishment Clause, which prohibits the government from establishing or creating a religion in any way. That's why we don't have an official religion in the United States. Now, I did a Prime Timers a few weeks ago. We kind of looked at some of this. And early on in the state constitutions, there were religious tests for people being able to run for office. Pennsylvania had a clause in its state constitution saying you had to profess Christianity to be able to hold office. There was a Jewish man who fought in the Revolution who actually kind of petitioned Pennsylvania to change, also wrote to the Constitutional Convention, and that was part of the reason they kind of changed those state constitutions and the U.S. Constitution. But for a long time, it was also interpreted without this amendment that, the national government couldn't create a religion or have an official one, but states could. So remember, in the early days, they were still trying to figure out the balance of the federal government and the state governments. We're still trying to figure out the balance of the state governments and the federal government. Then you have the Free Exercise Clause, which gives us all the right to worship God or not as we choose. That means the government can't punish you because of your religious beliefs or because you don't belong to a church or believe in God. Together, these freedoms make up the foundation of our freedom of conscience that protects our complete freedom of thought and opinion and the freedom to worship or not as we please. Remember when we talked a little bit, if you read all the essays from last year's Students' Anniversary, a lot of the Scots-Irish who immigrated here from what's now Northern Ireland, Ulster Plantation, they did so because they felt like second-class citizens in Ireland because they were Presbyterian. Now, another thing to make note of, back then, Presbyterian meant anything that's not Church of England or Catholic. So, Presbyterians are Methodists, Baptists, Moravians, Presbyterians, it's kind of that lump all dissenters, weirdos, as they might say. So these Presbyterians in Ireland, they were realizing they weren't getting to live in the same spots. They couldn't hold jobs. They couldn't hold public office because of these things called the Test Acts, which said, you had to, profess faith in the Church of England. And they're like, they've seen how that has gone badly. And so a lot of the founders of the Constitution were Presbyterians, had to come from Ireland under that situation. So we don't want the same issue to happen. Because, we might be number 1 for now, but that can always change. We've seen how religion and government tied too closely together always ends up excluding some, always ends up promoting kind of a hierarchical power struggle. What's interesting is, and I shared this a little bit at that Prime Timers, they also realized they've seen the bad of religion with government. They've also seen the bad of government with no religion, how that went bad. So a lot of these early founding fathers and mothers kind of wrote, and even some state constitutions, like, hey, we want to promote religion, promote Christianity, because we see in it kind of the common good. That often if a country can have a somewhat homogeneous belief system, it kind of promotes a common good. So they saw that we don't want to completely get religion out of everything, because we need some of that morality, that kind of common drive for good, but we also don't want to have it too official, because that can be a problem. So the founding generation are trying to figure out this whole thing called democracy and how to balance things. You know, states and federal government, religion, no religion, how much free speech, how many individual rights, how much can the government act, how do we make sure the executive doesn't have too much power, how do we make sure the judicial doesn't have too much power, the legislative. They realized early on that everything was basically on a knife edge. That you go too far one way or the other, the whole experiment can collapse. So it really was a genius document. So, next question we have to ask ourselves is, how do we know if the government has established a religion? How can we counteract the power of one group, usually the majority, to take away or curtail the rights of a religious minority? Those questions are at the heart of the First Amendment's protection of religious liberty, and they remain the most hotly contested questions of constitutional law today. So I remember several years ago, there was in Kentucky, a group of Muslims wanted to build a mosque there. And the town basically said, no, we don't like that. We're a Christian town, we don't want a mosque. And so they said all of that, but then they realized, well, we may not be able to say that blatantly, because they actually said the quiet part out loud. You know, that happens sometimes. So then they started couching things in other language. We have a bit of the same situation happening in Hershey right now, if you're aware of. Is anyone aware of the plans to build the mosque? Yeah. So we have the Hershey Islamic Center. They're kind of main imam. He's also works at the medical center, one of the leaders. I'm friends with him, and he's part of my kind of faith leaders group. And they're trying to build a larger complex out kind of on Middletown Road. And so they're trying to get zoning permissions. And part of the problem is like a legitimate issue of like not having two entrances because the sheet doesn't want to enter. It's all complicated. But if you read some of the comments that when Penn Live or the Sun posts, the amount of like anti-Islamic hate speech is virulent. I mean, it makes me want to throw my mouth a little bit reading all of it. And it's like all these things. We're a Christian nation. You can't have Muslims. It's like, did you not read the First Amendment? They did not. But you have these issues still today, and it kind of balances. How much can the federal government do? Can you put? Can a city put a 10 Commandments in the city park? That's come up multiple times. Sometimes it's been voted yes, and that's no. Now there are state laws saying it is a requirement for schools to recite and teach the 10 Commandments. That's going to get challenged. It'll be interesting to see how that goes, because it changes over time. So, let's look at the founding story of the religion clauses. So why did the founding generation write the religion clauses into the Bill of Rights? To answer this key question, it's important to remember a bit about the context in colonial America at the founding. We talked a little bit about this, but American settlers, often facing religious oppression at home, crossed the Atlantic in search of religious freedom. The result, a new world defined in part by religious diversity. We had Puritans in New England, Anglicans in the South, Quakers and Lutherans in Pennsylvania, Roman Catholics in Maryland, Presbyterians just spread everywhere like rabbits, Jewish congregations from Newport, Rhode Island to Savannah, Georgia. So you had all these different kind of religious groups. But early America wasn't just a land of religious diversity. It was also a society with many government-established churches. During colonial America, the Church of England was established by law in all of the southern colonies. and local Puritan Congregationalist establishments held sway in most of New England. Like, you go to New England, it's hard to find a Presbyterian church. There's like 6 of them. It's mostly Congregationalist churches. So what did these established churches look like? So clergy were often appointed and overseen by colonial officials. Colonists had to pay religious taxes. Some even had to attend church services. And dissenters were often punished for preaching without a license or refusing to pay church taxes. So anybody ever been to Williamsburg, Virginia before? Yeah, you go to the Bruton Parish Church. It's really nice stone building, nice graveyard. Have you found the Presbyterian meeting house? It's not easy to find. It's about the size of that corn in a little white clapboard building. Because again, you had to pay money to not be in the Church of England, and you didn't have any of the government funding of the church. So at the same time, there were a few states that didn't have any established churches, namely Delaware, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Rhode Island, and much of New York. So some states had established religions. Some states did not have established religions, but they did say you had to at least be Christian, like Pennsylvania in its first state constitution. So what does all this have to do with the history of the First Amendment? So following independence, there was a general consensus that the national government shouldn't be able to establish a national church. Not everyone agreed with this. You can go back and look at some of the early letters and debates. We don't have too much of the debates. I blame one man, kind of. So it's really interesting. Courtney, my wife, as you know, is doing a big project on Charles Thompson, kind of in partnership with Northern Ireland. So he was the secretary of both the Continental Congress and the Constitutional Convention. He took copious notes of everything. At the Constitutional Convention, they shut the windows so they didn't want anybody listening to hear, so it got really hot. Same thing with Constitutional Convention. They wanted no one to know what was happening, because they wanted people to be able to kind of freely share their crazy ideas, right? Because this is all brand new. Sometimes at session, we throw out some crazy ideas, or committees like, what if we did this? So you don't want anybody to know you said that, because it's kind of a crazy idea, you're not really sure. So Thompson wrote all this stuff down. John Jay, if you remember who John Jay was, one of the early Supreme Court Chief Justices, said, Thompson, you should really publish this. People should know all the conversations. And Thomas Jefferson said, throw it in the fire and burn it. He threw it in the fire and burned it. All those records. Was that a good choice or a bad choice? Read Courtney's book to find out. So yeah, we don't always know all the debates they had. And I'm sure there were some pretty tough ones, because you had people coming from different religious backgrounds, and you had people writing letters in, like the Jewish man from Pennsylvania who fought in the Revolution wrote that letter to the Constitutional Convention. So there was the whole, not everybody said from the beginning here, we definitely shouldn't have a national church. But there was kind of thinking that the national government shouldn't be in the business of enforcing a particular religious sect or set of beliefs. So the Establishment Clause, authored by James Madison of Virginia, reflected this consensus and the underlying belief that religious belief was actually helped by pluralism and a diversity of viewpoints rather than enforced belief. So it's kind of funny, Benjamin Franklin, who was kind of more of an agnostic, kind of talked about the actual importance of having religion, because he didn't solve for the common good, but the government shouldn't be in the business of enforcing it. So at the founding, this clause wasn't really a triumph of religious liberty, though. Instead, it was a triumph for federalism. The language of the clause itself applied only to the national government, calling out Congress. So following the ratification of the First Amendment and its Establishment Clause, the national government couldn't establish a national church, but states still could. And Congress couldn't interfere with or try to disestablish churches established by state and local governments. So even back then, local government like Derry Township could have said, you know what, we are called Derry Church for a reason. All people who live here must go to the Derry Presbyterian Church or be fined. They could do that. So even by 1833, all states had disestablished their state churches. They were allowed to have them, but by that time they realized probably not a good idea. But it didn't happen overnight. It didn't happen, boom, First Amendment, everybody's free to do as they choose. Like most things, things take time. So what about the free exercise clause? So it's important to remember that America is a nation defined in part by religious diversity, with many dissenters drawn to America by that promise of religious liberty. Although these new settlers often understood religious liberty more narrowly than we do today. So again, you have to kind of put yourself in that context. That's often our struggle with the Bible. We read the Bible as, people living in 2025 and not people living in 200 BC or 45 AD or anything like that, because the contexts are so different. So religious liberty was much more narrow. So support and protection of some conception of religious liberty was broad and deep. As a result, it shouldn't come as a surprise that the founding generation remained committed to the liberty of conscience. By the ratification of the U.S. Constitution, freedom of religion was among the most widely recognized natural rights, protected in some fashion by state bills of rights and judicial decisions. For example, James Madison, the main author of the First Amendment, expressed his support for such a provision in Virginia. He wrote, "It is the duty of every man to render to the Creator such homage, and such only as he believes to be acceptable to him. This duty is precedent both in order of time and degree of obligation to the claims of civil society." So this grew out of Madison's own experience in Virginia as a state legislator in the 1780s. In 1785, during the Virginia legislative debate over whether to continue to fund churches with tax money, Madison wrote an important petition called Memorial and Remonstrance, which listed 15 arguments against government support of churches, arguing that religion was a matter of individual conscience and could not be directed by the government in any capacity. Now, does the government support churches today? Yes or no? Yeah, in a lot of ways. Now, the church, they don't say every Presbyterian church you get $10,000 a year or anything. But you have non-exempt, you have exempt tax status. And one thing that's been a kind of interesting case for the last several years is clergy housing allowance are not taxed at the federal level. And that's been brought up at several different court cases by kind of atheist groups saying, whoa. Why does a small group of kind of Christian faith clergy get this tax break when if I want to be a pastor of a satanic church, I don't get a tax break? And so it's been tried and found at different appeals courts different ways. But so like my housing allowance is not taxed at the federal level, but it is taxed at the state level. Like clergy taxes are super complicated because I'm technically self-employed, but I'm not. But I am, so I pay self-employment tax, but some of that's taxed at the state level, some of the federal, and different things. Because again, how the federal church deals with churches and clergy is still an interesting matter of debate. And there's still ongoing litigation and court cases dealing with all those things. There's one just kind of about, can government grant money go to like Catholic charities and the work they do? They just had a case about this 2 weeks ago where the majority of the court said, yes, it still can go to Catholic charities. The argument against it was this group, whether it's Catholic charities, are really doing something any secular group can do too. What makes it necessarily religious? Therefore, you shouldn't get these protections, all this stuff. But most of the justices, both liberal and conservative, kind of challenged, well, who's going to make this litmus test of what's a religious action or not? So you can go back and find that if you want to read more about it. But it's these kind of issues, the Ten Commandments being required to be taught at public schools, the display at state houses, who can get federal grant money, can religious private schools get federal funding? All these things are happening right now. So it's not like this was decided then and now it's all clear. So, of course, the original Constitution itself promoted religious liberty with Article 6 banning religious tests for federal offices. So you do have in the actual body of the Constitution, Article 6, there cannot be religious tests for office. Remember, all those Presbyterians from Ireland were barred from public office because of that kind of test. So they wanted that in quickly. But again, state Most states still had that at the time of the Constitution, Pennsylvania included. So, but we the people also wrote protections for religious liberty in the Bill of Rights when we ratified the Free Exercise Clause in 1791. So in the end, James Madison, the first Congress, drafted the First Amendment with this kind of history in mind of this religious pluralism, which for the day was very diverse. Now, based on, they didn't have Hindus, Sikhs, Muslims, Buddhists, Taoists, all of that, but they had several different branches of Christianity, which often were just as seemingly opposite sometimes as Muslims, Hindus, Buddhists, and all of that. So it seems like it was a small subset, but to them, they were major differences. Now we see those differences as small because we have more. So there was still a plurality of religions, but just different from today. So let's look more in detail at the Establishment Clause and some fun Supreme Court cases. And if you're at Timely Topics, we looked at all kinds of Supreme Court cases. We'll look at more of those after the second service when it comes to freedom of speech and how those debates are ramping up again. So it did take quite some time before the Establishment Clause as we know it today kind of emerged. For instance, it wasn't until the 1940s that the Supreme Court finally held that the Establishment Clause applied against state religious entanglements. This is kind of incorporation. So not until the 1940s that it kind of applied to state things as well. So we don't have a national church and no longer have established churches in the states. So what does the Establishment Clause mean today? Well, there are some easy cases. So virtually all jurists would agree that it would violate the Establishment Clause for the government to require church attendance. Only some crazies are going to be like, no, that's fine. Pretty much across the board, jurists have always said that's a no-no. Or for the government to mess with the religious organization's selection of clergy, or its religious doctrines. So the government can't come in and say, no, Presbyterians, we think you shouldn't do infant baptism anymore. At law. They're not going to do that. Unless we start doing some weird things like dunking their head underwater for a really long period of time. Which, in the Armenian church, they get a naked baby and they kind of put him in and then flip him back, and flip him back, and the baby comes up terrified. I would hate that too. But the government does not infringe upon the doctrine. Or for the government to grant benefits to some religious entities but not others without some legitimate non-religious justification. That's getting a little bit more hazy now, as you'll see in some of these upcoming cases. Whether it's like, okay, we'll give to a private Christian school, but not to a private Muslim school. It's kind of, it doesn't the same way, but, at Christmas time every year, often schools used to do kind of pageants and things in schools, and still a lot do today. And people get very mad if they suggest not to. I've often suggested that's fine, but, it's Ramadan right now. Can we have some Ramadan songs in school? Well, of course not. That then becomes prioritizing some in favor of others. Technically would be against the Constitution. But that's about it. Those four things are really the only things that are pretty clear on. Many other issues remain hotly contested. And many of these cases lead to 5-4 decisions at the Supreme Court. So let's first talk about the legal test that covers the Establishment Clause. So the Lemon test. Anyone ever heard of the Lemon test? It's not a car. It's a 1971 case, Lemon versus Kurtzman. There's a legal test the court has traditionally applied to these cases, and it's called the Lemon test, named after this 1971 case. To pass this test, a law has to do three things. One, it has to have a secular legislative purpose. Two, its primary effect has to neither advance nor inhibit religion. And three, the law can't cause excessive entanglement between government and religion. Because when you get entangled, bad things happen. I'm doing a lot of study on Nazi Germany right now. A lot of bad things happen through the government's use of the church and the church's use of the government. More on that next summer. Whole series of classes on that. Have I written them yet? Yes. Be ready. So, now many Supreme Court justices have strongly criticized this test now, but the court has never overruled it, but we're tiptoeing up to the line. At the same time, the Supreme Court does sometimes decide Establishment Clause cases without applying that test. And in some specific areas, the court has also crafted specific targeted tests to replace limit. So it's a bit of a mess. That's how the Supreme Court kind of works. It's a bit of a mess, but it works. There's good and bad, right? So, because you have new justices all the time, which can be a good thing. Some people say we need term limits on the justices, and there's a good reason for that. But on the flip side, you're going to keep getting new people in who are going to have new ideas. Same thing happens with the legislative or the executive branch, right? We've been looking about, how do we deal with China as a country and a potential threat? But when you change administration every 4 or 8 years, you can't have a long-term strategy. That's one of the downsides of democracy. There's a lot of upsides, but there's always downsides. So one of the issues with the Supreme Court is we keep getting new people, and so you keep rethinking these old ideas. And so you don't always have precedents saying, well, we decided this at this time, we're never going to change it. We have seen a lot of changes recently, and in the past that a new court says this was a bad decision. Because some decisions were very bad, like the Dred Scott case. Really bad overall decision. Like pretty much no jurist today says, you know what, that majority opinion was really well crafted there in the Dred Scott case. Everybody's like, that was bad. So sometimes you need to, but you do have this kind of turnover. So let's look at 3 common types of Establishment Clause cases. You're all going to be like Supreme Court scholars. That's going to be great. So area number 1. I only got 20 minutes left. My goodness. All right. So first, we have aid to religious education or other activities conducted by religious institutions. In this area, scholars have divided between 2 opposing interpretations of the Establishment Clause. One set of scholars argues that the government must be neutral between religious and non-religious institutions that provide education or other social services, like Catholic charities providing refugee relief, or adoption, or housing, all of that. We have the Catholic charities down in Harrisburg. There's a lot of that stuff. The other set argues for a bright line rule, arguing that no taxpayer funds should be given to religious institutions if they might be used to communicate religious doctrine. And the Supreme Court itself has moved between these positions over time. So some say you can do it, but you can't prioritize religion over secular. Say, well, we're going to give more to Catholic charities than to some secular adoption service. Or we're going to give more to church world service than refugee resettlement that has no religious affiliation. And then also you can't say, well, we like Catholics better, so we're going to give it all to them and not to church world service. That's one kind of thing. As long as you aren't prioritizing or making it unfair. The other side says, if you're a religious group, need not apply, we shouldn't have any government funds affecting that. So initially the court followed the first approach. Then in the 1970s and 80s, it shifted to the second one, no government funding for any of these. For instance, the court first upheld state laws allowing students to attend private religious schools to receive transportation funded by the state government. Everson versus Board of Education, 1947. Then, for roughly 15 years, the court tried to draw sharper lines against the use of government money for religious schools. For instance, banning public schools teaching specialists from going to religious schools to provide remedial assistance to students. So having somebody from Jewish school or whatever coming in and kind of teaching these kind of courses. However, more recently, the court has upheld programs that give government money to educational or social programs on a neutral basis. As the court describes it in a 2002 case, only as a result of the genuine and independent choices of private individuals. So it's going back and forth. And then again, saw the one with Catholic charities a few weeks ago. These things keep getting litigated in different ways. And the court has struck down state laws that keep religious institutions that otherwise qualify for government aid assistance solely from getting it. So Trinity Lutheran Church of Columbia versus Comer in 2017, certain courts said, no, you can't get any of this money, even though you applied for it because you're a religious institution. So you see how it gets kind of confusing. How far do you go? How do you know if it's being handled in a non-prejudice basis? Because often it might seem like one religious group gets a lot more funding than others. So that's one area, kind of religious education. The second area is government-sponsored prayer. This is probably the most famous set of cases under the Establishment Clause. These decisions held it unconstitutional for public schools to lead school children in prayer or Bible reading, even on a voluntary basis. So you have a 1962 and 1963 case that says, no, you cannot lead children in public schools in prayer or have a special Bible class. Well, we know that happens all the time now, right? So courts have changed since the 60s. These cases received a great deal of backlash from the public. People are like, what, we can't teach Bible in a special class in school and have a Christian club? We had one when I was in junior high. But the court has stood its ground. And it's even goes so far as to extend the prayer ban to graduation ceremonies in a 1992 case and football games in a 2000 case. However, in setting involving adults, the court has generally allowed government-sponsored prayer, upholding the legislative prayer, because it was steeped in history. We have a prayer in Congress all the time. There's a chaplain. The last chaplain before she got fired was Presbyterian. They got caught in all the purge with everybody else. They just had a prayer recently. So the only time Cory Booker stopped his 25-hour speech was the prayer, the midday prayer at noon. So it's happening in the halls of government, right? So, but then you have just recently, I think I put it later on in the lesson, a Supreme Court case that said a coach was wrongly fired for offering prayer after football games and found in the coach's favor. So, again, it's changing. So concerns about coercion or not seem to be doing most of the work in these cases, with the court concluding that young students are much more vulnerable than adults. In 2022, the Supreme Court case heard Kennedy versus Bremerton School District, that's the one I talked about, and ruled in favor of a high school coach who lost his job because of his post-game prayers at the 50-yard line. By a vote of 6-3, the justices ruled that Joseph Kennedy's conduct was protected by the First Amendment. If that case had been tried in the 80s, he probably would have lost. Just seeing how the court shifts. It's not just a liberal conservative thing either. You look at some of these cases, the conservative justices were also against this. So how the nature of conservative versus liberal justices also changed over the years as well. The court rejected the public school district's argument that allowing Kennedy's prayers to continue would have violated the Constitution's Establishment Clause, as bars the government from both establishing an official religion and preferring one religion over another. And it pushed back against the argument that students might have felt obligated to join Kennedy's prayer, stressing that learning how to tolerate speech or prayer of all kinds is part of learning how to live in a pluralistic society, a trait of character essential to a tolerant citizenry. So you have that kind of theory, hey, you're welcome to go pray at the 50-yard line with the coach, but you don't have to. The problem is, sometimes people kind of know it's not said, but it's said. Like, you better be out there. Dabo Sweeney at Clemson University, people who've left this program kind of said, if you don't participate in those prayer meetings, you're not going to have a good spot on the team. Now, it's never said, but it's said. So how do you then legislate that? Because there is the freedom, hey, if you want to be able to pray, pray. But don't weaponize it. But it's hard to enforce that. So you see that happening a lot. A few weeks earlier, from that case, on the exact same 6-3 ideological lines and votes, the court struck a Maine law down that banned the use of public funds for students to use at private schools that provide religious instruction. So you see now, in 2022, you can use that, but before it was you can't. So you see the changing ideas. The final area is government-owned or sponsored religious symbols. These cases are also high profile. They involve governmental displays of religious symbols. So these are cases involving Ten Commandments on display in public school classrooms, courthouses, or public parks, nativity scenes in courthouses and shopping districts, crosses on public land. They remain quite controversial. In recent years, the court's main approach to these cases has often been sort of an endorsement test. The test asks the common sense question of whether a reasonable observer acquainted with the full context would regard the display as the government endorsing religion and therefore sending a message of discouragement to other believers and non-believers. So the court has rejected taking a rigid absolutist approach in these cases. The results have predictably varied. So in 1984, Lynch v. Donnelly, the court upheld the display of a nativity scene surrounded by other holiday decorations in the heart of a shopping district, stating that it engenders a friendly community spirit of goodwill in keeping with the season. They kind of said, okay, you got a Christmas tree, you got some ornament balls, you got a nativity scene, it's fine, people, chill out. Just basically, it's the Supreme Court's thing. People are feeling good about it. Now, if somebody had tried to, be interesting in 1984, if somebody said, we want some Diwali lights along with that too, it's also part of the season, or a Kwanzaa candle thing, would the town have allowed that? Now, if they said no to that, I would hope the Supreme Court would be like, no, you can't have the nativity scene if you won't allow the Kwanzaa candle as engendering this kind of spirit, because then you start having the prioritizing and favorites. But it would be interesting to see how they would have responded. In County of Allegheny vs. ACLU in 1989, a different set of justices held that the display of the nativity scene by itself at the top of a grand stairway in the courthouse did violate the Establishment Clause because it was indisputably religious, indeed sectarian. So now you have nothing else, you just have one nativity scene in the public courthouse. Like, no, that's going a bit too far. Because there are other faiths, you're setting one above. But it's a different set of justices. 2005, the court held that a prominent display of the Ten Commandments at the county courthouse, which was preceded by an official's description of the Ten Commandments as the embodiment of ethics in Christ, was unconstitutional. While on the same day, upholding the Ten Commandments monument, which was donated by a secular organization dedicated to reducing juvenile delinquency and surrounded by other monuments on the spacious state grounds. So only Breyer was in the majority of both cases. So one was no, because it says this is what Christ says, and it's by itself. The other was yes, because it's by a secular group and has other monuments about justice around it. So there's that kind of test of, does it seem to an observer to be like, this is what the government thinks? So if you have a courthouse that's only displaying Christian doctrine, that can make it seem like somebody, the United States must have an established Christian religion, because here at the courthouse, these are the rules, and it's in the Bible. Now, if it's in a memorial with other things, it's different. So, most recently, the Supreme Court upheld a large cross on public lands commemorating veterans of World War I, American Legion versus American Humans Association. The argument was, here's public ground, you have this giant kind of cross there, it's kind of showing, hey, this is a Christian area. Supreme Court said, not so much, because while the cross is very Christian, it's also become kind of a symbol of memorializing death. And in this park, it's a memorial to World War I veterans. So it takes on even a greater meaning. Because most people, when they see a cross on a graveyard, don't just think sacrifice of Christ. They think memorializing death. Churches may have disagreement on that at times, but once you put a symbol out there, you have no control over the symbol anymore, right? Just like if you put a poem out there, people can interpret it any way you want. You can't say, you're not allowed to interpret my poem that way, or my art that way. So symbols often change meanings. So we were in Greece, and we saw swastikas a lot of places. Now, the Greek people were major kind of resistors against Nazi Germany. They had actually two national holidays. One is March 25th, while we were there, everything was shut down. It was like the beginning of the Greek independence. The other was in the fall, and it basically means no, it's okay. Their word for no sounds like okay, but that no is basically when they started saying to the Nazis, nope, we're not going along with your plan, and we're going to resist. And Greece got hit really, really hard by Nazis coming in, taking the Jewish population, destroying villages, bombing a lot of stuff. But they were very much against Nazism. But you have these swastikas. Same thing in India. You see them all over the place. Because they didn't start out meaning what we think of them today. When you see a swastika today, what do you think? Nazis. Before 1930, 1920, you saw a swastika, it meant something very different. So symbols change. They often, like magnets, take on different kinds of meanings. So that often also becomes problematic for the Supreme Court. Like the Ten Commandments, right? Some people think of it, the one guy said, this is the embodiment of Christ's ethics. Well, who were the Ten Commandments first to? Jews. I mean, it's also very embodiment of Jewish stuff. So some people think it means one or the other. It can mean both. A lot of the Ten Commandments are based on an older kind of Hammurabi code. I mean, so all these things kind of get added together. So a lot of people don't mind the Ten Commandments so much because they're kind of like more universal good ideas, where they might get more mad of like a giant crucifix on the state grounds or something. So even over the past 50 years even, our ideas of how some symbols work change, and so the Supreme Court has sometimes changed with how our symbols change as well. So currently, a few states have made a law requiring the display of the Ten Commandments. So that will most likely make its way to the Supreme Court. It'll be interesting to see how the Supreme Court rules, and also the context of those displays. Because you might see a news article that says, I don't know, Louisiana has made a requirement to have the Ten Commandments in all its state house grounds. Okay. What's the context of it? Is it the only thing there? Does it have a big sign that says, you better follow these or God won't love you anymore? Is it next to another old idea of justice that's next to it? So it's important, the Supreme Court's going to look at the larger context, hopefully. We do as well, and not just jump to different conclusions. That make sense? So, okay, we got 5 minutes left. This is part one. This is mostly the Establishment Clause part. Next week, we're going to look at what it means more the free exercise of religion. Anybody have any questions, comments, religiously tinged remarks about the Establishment Clause or the recent Supreme Court cases? I am not a Supreme Court expert, just so you know. Doris?
I just have a question. Do you think since Louisiana has said that the Ten Commandments have to be the King James Version, that would be problematic?
I don't know how the Supreme Court will think. If you have to have a certain version, I mean, come on, Louisiana, that's like the worst version. King James Version is not exactly a great translation of the Bible. It's poetic, but as far as accuracy, if you really want to get to the brunt of it, what's accurate. And then, of course, which version of the Ten Commandments? There's two different ones in the Bible. Which one are you using as the actual Ten Commandments? One of them, women are property. So are you using that one? Because if that's on the court, and it says women are property, can someone bring a case to the court of it and say, hey, this actually, the thing at your courthouse says women are property. Why can't I treat them as such? It's on your steps. Isn't that supporting it? Somebody would probably make that argument. I don't think it would work, but it's an interesting argument. Which Ten Commandments are they going to use? From Exodus or Deuteronomy? Which translation? I don't know. I forgot. I just made up Louisiana, but I forgot that was actually one of the states that required it. So that's the first one that came to mind. So I don't know. It'll be interesting to see what the arguments and rationale are from the Supreme Court, how they rule in those cases. And then maybe they allow Louisiana and disallow Alabama. Again, how they do it. Because they did allow one and disallow the other in the same Supreme Court term. So,
have you ever verified the background of the justices, where they came from? Did they come from a very religious Bible Belt district opposed to a more liberal major city?
Have I done that?
Has that ever been done? So you can understand why the things have changed. Because if you get Bible Belt type conservative people, they're going to interpret it different than, I would think, than some of the more liberal judges from California or New York.
In theory, it shouldn't matter, because you're basically saying, are they qualified to understand and rule law? But we see that's not the case anymore, because both parties are now going after justices based on what they think, how they think they're going to interpret, and their interpretation method. Because you have different interpretational methods of the Constitution. It's a whole other conversation. But those things now come up of, well, this person has a history of supporting this and not that. This person always supported the Christian cases and never supported the Muslim cases. How can they do this? Or vice versa. They never, ever gave a fair shake to the Christian communities and always sided with the secularists. How is that? So you have those things coming up when they go before Congress sometimes. So kind of everything's fair game at this point, it seems. It doesn't always make a difference. But in theory, It's supposed to be, do you have the experience and knowledge to be able to execute good decisions based on an understanding of the Constitution? And there always are going to be different ways of interpreting the Constitution, right? Just like there are different ways of interpreting the Bible. I was on, with this Greece tour, there were 44 of us, but 26 came from a Catholic church, and their priest was there. So it's interesting sometimes how we approach different things. And we had a lot of conversations. We did like an ending kind of all worship service with everybody kind of together with Catholics and some Protestants and stuff. But how we interpret things, like purgatory, is very different. Doesn't mean he's a bad Christian, I'm a good Christian, or vice versa. We have a different interpretive lens. And I think those different interpretive lenses can be a positive thing for the Supreme Court if people kind of hold that respect and kind of keep an open mind and aren't too rigid. And you've seen both sides sometimes. They might be strict originalists, but in certain cases they stray away from that, sometimes because of the politics. Or they're not originalists, but when it suits them, they interpret it like an originalist. So there's that too. But we all do that with sometimes how we interpret even our own faith. At times we'll be like, hey, the Bible says this, that's what I believe. And when somebody brings up something else we don't really like, well, in that case, it's more contextual. And that's often difficult with the Bible. When is it a prescriptive statement that Jesus or whoever means this covers everybody? And when is it more figurative or contextual? For an example, Jesus talking to the rich young ruler and says, to sell everything, if you want to follow me, sell everything you own. Is that prescriptive or contextual? Does that mean everybody should do that if they want to follow Jesus? Or was it just to that guy in that circumstance? Now, if you say just to that guy in that circumstance, then you can say later, well, when he said that we have to love our enemies, that was really just to one guy. So it's always tricky. We always are able, you can interpret anything the way you want to interpret anything, basically, and make a reason for it. And that's why it's important to kind of keep reading the Bible and really try to be honest with what is it really saying to me today. And we're always going to interpret it first and foremost, whether we want it or not, through our own experience, right? Same thing with justices, I think. Their unique experiences are going to lead them to interpret the Constitution in unique ways. And we can't expect them not to do that. Because as Christians, we're always going to interpret the Bible through our own experiences to a large degree. And if we say we're just stepping back, and I always hear people say, I'm just reading the Bible for what it is. I'm just letting the words speak for themselves. Like, no, you're not. When anybody says that, I know they're particularly not doing that. Because we all read it through the lens of our lives, through the experiences we have. Everything we do is interpreted through the past experiences we've had. If you've been bitten by 25 dogs, and a dog comes running at you, what are you going to think? You're going to have a bit of fear. That's natural, probably smart. Dogs hate you for some reason. I don't know why. But that experience affects how you interpret that. Now, you may realize later that dog was super nice, but before that, you get an experience, that's going to come to mind. So we always read through the lens of our experience. All right, so if you're interested, Tommy topics in the chapel after worship. We're going to look at what the freedom of speech clause is in the Bill of Rights and a particular court case that kind of deals with that and talk about some of the major things happening today around the world when it comes to free speech and politics in France, in Turkey, in Romania, all these places. So if you're interested in that, show up after worship. Next week we'll look more about the free exercise clause and look at some Supreme Court cases that deal with that. Thank you very much.
Good.